Okay. I think we should start. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Rachel Bowlby to lecture here this evening, who I don't think has been for a couple of years. Rachel is currently Professor of English Literature at Sussex University. Originally read classics at Oxford, did her research at Yale, went to Sussex, where she produced a kind of shaming series of number of books. Firstly, on her graduate work, the book Just Looking on the Rise of the Department Store, then a study on Virginia Woolf, and then a study really of the flaneuse, the walking woman, called Still Crazy After All These Years. Most recently, currently shopping with Freud. So it's a pleasure to welcome Rachel. Thank you very much.
One night, sometime in the 1890s, a Viennese lady had a dream about smoked salmon, Sunday closing, and shopping by phone. She might never have remembered it, much less mentioned it, but this lady happened to be seeing a doctor who had some ideas about dreams. So it was that this dream went down in the epic that Freud produced in 1900, and has continued to make itself felt and heard throughout the 20th century. This is the text of the dream. I wanted to give a supper party, but I had nothing in the house but a little smoked salmon. I thought I would go out and buy something, but remembered then that it was Sunday afternoon, and all the shops would be shut. Next, I tried to ring up some caterers, but the telephone was out of order, so I had to abandon my wish to give a supper party. The dream is presented as being derived from a conscious desire on the patient's part to prove Freud wrong in his hypothesis that dreams always represent wishes as fulfilled. Look, it seems to be saying, here is a dream where the wish is patently unfulfilled. Freud's commentary, based on supplementary material from the dreamer's amorous preoccupations, proceeds with characteristic interpretive bravado to two distinct but not mutually exclusive conclusions from this apparently innocuous and ordinary little dream. To cut a long analysis short, from the additional information that the dreamer experienced a daily desire for a caviar sandwich but denied herself its satisfaction, supposedly on the grounds of expense, Freud derives first the notion of a new and strange kind of wish, the wish for an unsatisfied wish, rewritten more recently in post-Lacanian lexicons as the desire for an unsatisfied desire. Secondly, Freud infers from the circumstantial details of the patient's life that the dream conceals a movement of identity. Thus, he says, the dream will acquire a new interpretation if we suppose that the person indicated in the dream was not herself but her friend, that she had put herself in her friend's place, or, as we might say, that she had identified herself with her friend. This mobility of identification is indissociable in Freud from the constancy of wishing to all subjective life, wishing for something else, wishing to be something else. In the final part of the interpretation of dreams, Freud describes the origins of the wishing subject in the baby who seeks to recover the remembered satisfaction of the breast. Such a wish to restore an earlier state of things is taken to be the paradigm and prototype of all desire, but also to be the driving force of mental activity and development. It provides the orientation to an imagined future, when pleasure will have been granted or given back, that keeps the subject moving on through what is henceforth lived in the form of linear time, connecting a past, a present, and future. Wishing faces forwards and backwards at once, taking a future direction from the memory of a past satisfaction. The gap between the two, between an imagined satisfaction and its fulfillment, is constitutive, not accidental. Paradoxically, its perpetuation is essential for the continuation of active life. To close it would be inertia or death. In a very different mode from the interpretation of dreams, Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class, another turn-of-the-century classic, published in 1899, is also concerned with the relationship between desire and mobility. For Veblen, the wish to rise socially is one of the fundamental urges of human nature, and at some points it appears as the fundamental urge. This disposition to mobility is based on a rivalry between men that manifests itself in the competitive exhibition of wealth. The book's a wonderfully ironic analysis of the social and economic mores of the American East Coast upper classes, cast in the form of an anthropological investigation of a primitive race. It places at the center of human motivations an instinct for what he calls emulation, such that men in patriarchal society will seek to present themselves as equal or superior to their fellows by the signs of what Veblen called, in his famous coinage, conspicuous consumption. The display associated with conspicuous consumption was characteristically delegated to women, who became the vicarious consumers and visible exhibits of the wealth and status to be attributed to the man. To the disposition that would later be known as the drive towards upward mobility, this theory gives a primary place in what is in every sense, and giving a full weight to each of the two terms, a social psychology. In the final decades of the 19th century, Montgomery Ward's famous mail-order catalogue that took consumption goods into rural areas of the United States was known as the Great Wish Book. Look, and you shall wish. Wish to have new objects, and wish to be a different person. The one who has what the things that the book, the one who has what the things, has the things that the book prompts you to want. For a consumption-led economy depends on assuming that man, and especially that woman, is or may become a wishing animal, a creature whose being is bound up with unsatisfied desires and changeable personae. It depends, that is, on being able to mould or direct the dispositions of potential buyers, to push or bring them to want what they otherwise might not have sought. And it was just at the time when Freud and Veblen were writing that the new enterprises ancillary to the expansion of such an economy, the enterprises of marketing and advertising, turned their attention and their investments towards the rapidly evolving science of psychology. In order to sell more goods, so the argument went, it's necessary to understand the mind of the person persuaded to buy. This was the beginning of the study of consumer psychology, firmly established as a presence in academic as well as business institutions by the time of the publication of Walter Dill Scott's landmark work, The Psychology of Advertising, in 1908. And in this connection, the text of the smoked salmon dream may show up under an aspect ignored by Freud, its modern consumerly setting. This is, after all, at one level, a sitcom-style dream of everyday shopping frustrations, the phone out of order, and a store closed because it's Sunday. For readers of the late 20th century, the affluence connoted by the domestic phone and by the projected trading with a shop itself fitted with this expensive facility is a further element that may not be immediately apparent. In Freud's analysis, these everyday details of the dream sink into insignificance, or rather, they simply remain on the surface. So too does the connection of the wish for an unsatisfied wish with the costliness of a caviar sandwich. And whether he's dealing with a dream or with any other manifestation of psychic life is the common structure in Freud. On the one hand, he directs attention to disregarded minutiae of everyday life, and with the other hand, in a second movement, he takes away their significance. Quotidian detail proves only to have been the means to uncovering deeper, buried layers of meaning. It's in fact a common practice in many kinds of writing to treat consumerly practices and desires in this way, as mere surface or setting, beneath or behind which lie more serious and more complicated matters. It's not, however, my intention to overturn this hierarchy by making the shopping setting into the hidden because too visible meaning of the dream. For one thing, that would be to stay with the two-tier division of outside and inside, surface and kernel meanings, which is part of the difficulty here. Also, although there are plenty of other dreams in the interpretation which are also about shopping, there are rather more that are not, but which nonetheless involve the manifestation of unknown desires and shifts of identification. What's remarkable in this case is the interlocking of the two economies normally held apart, what are habitually differentiated as psychic from social, internal from external economies, appear in this dream and its analysis in all the inextricability of their connections. There's no need to seek for links between Veblen's theory and consumer culture. they're there to be seen in that pointedly visible designation of conspicuous consumption. This is already a postmodern world of self-advertisement, spectacle, and surfaces. You are what you appear. In other words, what you are seen to be. And it makes no difference whether or not the sign represents any actual substance or not. There is also in Veblen a theory of the different relations of the sexes to the mode and aims of consumption. Men and women are placed in particular ways, as distinct and complementary, in relation to the practices of consumption. More than that, it is their distinction in these consumerly terms which actually constitutes the difference of the sexes. Throughout this century, advertising and marketing in general have both drawn on and developed psychological research. In fact, out of 4 basic models of the consumer subject identified in the literature of marketing psychology from the 20s on, 2 are none other than the Freudian model and the Veblen model. The first taking from psychoanalysis the idea of repressed desires and fears for advertising to tap, and the second taking from Veblen a generalized model of motivation through the desire for social prestige. There's no clear institutional or other boundary between what might be called pure, disinterested psychology and this other kind, directed towards discovering how minds work, with the express intention of thereby discovering how they might be persuaded to want new things, or to identify themselves with the kind of person who buys this or that commodity. Frequently, funding for psychology departments in the United States, and especially during the early years of the discipline, came from marketing interests. But instead of trying to gauge what proportion of psychological research was prompted by advertising and what proportion was not, the problem should be put another way. The development of psychology cannot be separated from the development of a consumer culture, with its investment in the making or prompting of unsatisfied desires and changing identities. The two things are part of one and the same process, whereby subjects come to be regarded not primarily as political animals, but rather as subjective individuals, subjectivities, as the current language has it, with wishes and other feelings that go to make up more or less fluctuating and modifiable identities. There's no interest from the point of view of advertising in assuming any given unmodifiable bedrock of human nature beyond or against which persuasions couldn't or shouldn't operate. In the words of a British survey of attitudes to supermarkets in 1963, shoppers are on the move, psychologically as well as physically. No dispositions are necessarily immutable. What matters is only their practical effects at the present time, which may suggest that they be taken into account in the kind of advertising appeal that is made. What may appear to be the most basic of differentials between male and female is only significant for advertising insofar as it functions pragmatically as a limit to the possible ways in which people may be invited or urged to respond. As an American advertising psychologist sharply put it in 1913, whether the difference be interpreted to mean a fundamental and inherent sex difference or merely a difference which reflects our present social organization, which is doubtless an adequate explanation of all the facts, has nothing to do with the present usefulness of the fact itself. It's in these sorts of connections that, for their own pragmatic and interested reasons, advertising psychologists can in fact appear to be the most radical of theorists, willing and ready to discard even the deepest held assumptions about psychological or social normality in their determination never to regard identities as fixed. This author goes on to cite another of Walter Scott's books, Influencing Men in Business, in which Scott declares himself inclined to question the popular notion that women are prone to react more strongly to emotional situations than are men. A British writer from a little later definitively takes that line, stating categorically on what he calls the question of the male buyer, that he is by no means so analytical a reader as a woman. And from the evidence of this man's book, one would tend to infer that the same sexual distinction applies to writers, too. Arguments about and representations of the consumer mind have a complicated and intricate history. Much can be learned from the likenesses and the differences between the kinds of consumer to be found in writings that are directly concerned with the subject and those that appear in others that aren't. There are the various hypothetical consumers whose psychology is discussed in books dedicated to the topic, and there are those who make unlikely and often surreptitious appearances in fall guy or more often fall girl roles in writings concerned principally with other questions. And later on, I'll be looking at some local examples of this in the field of general cultural criticism. But the distinction implied in the quotation about analytical and emotional readers has been used in various permutations to differentiate two types of consumer all through this century, and usually along gendered lines in the opposite direction from those heretically suggested by Scott and his followers. The consumer viewed as passively open to all the emotional appeals of advertising and marketing is normally feminine, just as the rational analytical judge is normally masculine. It's the first emotional type that's collectivized as the passive, deluded population of that state called consumer society, which reached the heights of its discursive import on both sides of the Atlantic in the decades after the Second World War. In broad terms, these two versions of the consumer have structured theories of and arguments about consumption and advertising for the last half century. The distinction extends to and shifts about in a whole range of familiar oppositions between the agent in control of his thoughts and interests and the powerless victim of advertising's onslaughts, between masculine and feminine or mature and infantile dispositions, between the saver and the spender. In terms of British history, the analytical type is personified in the intended reader of Which, whose sensible buying behaviour deliberately counters the opposite associations of the late 1950s consumer as dupe, hapless victim of the blandishments of the new television advertising. It was this foolish, passive consumer whose image was dominant until, during the 1980s, in an extraordinary turnabout, consumers were all of a sudden invested with every positive attribute and promoted into being the very standard bearers of citizenship itself. Patients, parents, voters, students, and others were all subsumed under the general heading of consumers, with the designation now rhetorically endowing them with the rights and rationality of which their predecessors, by implication, had been deprived. In the implied narrative here, the political animal finds its highest development in the mode of rational consumer. This is a striking example of a forceful deployment of the category of consumer in areas not wholly or primarily or initially associated with market transactions. I say initially because one of the effects of using a language of consumer choice is precisely to push the practice concerned towards actually becoming, now as though by natural destiny, a market area. Another aspect of the alternation of rational and non-rational models of the consumer concerns their relation to individual or collective psychology. Just before the war, works on advertising, particularly those published in Britain, started to include defensive arguments to distinguish its methods from those that were increasingly becoming associated with Nazism and fascism. Collective persuasion is perceived as being inherently more insidious in its effects because somehow less amenable to resistance than the one-to-one model of selling which predominates in salesmanship manuals and consumer psychology before this time. In discussions of two-person encounters, the active-passive polarity is seen as relatively flexible. The upper hand can move about between salesman and buyer during the process leading up to the sale. But the notion of the mass in a psychology of mass consumption tends to involve assumptions of the involuntary renunciation of a firm and primarily active individual subjectivity through capitulation to a collective feeling assumed to be automatic and mindless in the same way as the techniques which bring it about. In critiques of advertising in the Cold War period, this forceful and idiosyncratic conjunction of the collective, the illegitimate, and the effective was further reinforced by the implied comparison with communist Russia, and brainwashing becomes the ominous shorthand for the insidious techniques attributed at once to the secret police and to the manipulators of Madison Avenue. In the rest of the paper, I would like to look at a particular strand of this 1950s configuration, using as a springboard some essays by the American poet Randall Jarrell. A Sad Heart at the Supermarket is the title he gave to his contribution to a symposium on contemporary mass culture in 1959, at which he, along with James Baldwin and others, were included as representing the creative artists among a group of intellectuals. It may seem a kind of special pleading or special choosing to focus on a literary perspective on consumer culture. However, this area is not a sideline in the general field of debates about consumption. Indeed, it could be argued that cases both for and against something called consumer society or consumer culture have regularly, not just occasionally, been constructed in relation to idealized or denigrated notions of a more authentic, artistic, or literary culture. Putting this the other way round, it's also true that arguments about the place and value of art have typically presented themselves through some kind of rejection of consumer culture or mass culture, thereby represented as monolithic and homogeneous. Mediocrity and conformity are the fate of those who succumb to, or are powerless to keep aloof from, the overwhelming forces of the grey or gaudy surrounding consumer world. Now, for my money, the locus classicus in this matter, and indeed the key to all media studies mythologies, past and future, is an extraordinary footnote near the beginning of Coleridge's Biographia Literaria in 1817, which reads as follows. This is a very long quotation. For as to the devotees of the circulating libraries, I dare not compliment their pastime, or rather kill time, with the name of reading. Call it rather a sort of beggarly daydreaming, during which the mind of the dreamer furnishes for itself nothing but laziness and a little mawkish sensibility, while the whole material and imagery of the doze is supplied from the outside by a sort of mental camera obscura manufactured at the printing office, which for the time being fixes, reflects, and transmits the moving phantasms of one man's delirium, so as to people the barrenness of 100 other brains afflicted with the same trance or suspension of all common sense and all definite purpose. We should therefore transfer this species of amusement, if indeed those can be said to retire from the muses who were never in their company, or relaxation be attributable to those whose bows are never bent, we should distinguish it from the genus reading to the comprehensive class characterized by the power of reconciling the two contrary yet coexisting propensities of human nature, namely indulgence of sloth and hatred of vacancy. In addition to novels and tales of chivalry in prose and rhyme, this genus comprises as its species gaming, swinging or swaying on a chair or gate, spitting over a bridge, smoking, snuff-taking, tete-a-tete quarrels after dinner between husband and wife, conning word by word all the advertisements in the daily advertiser in a public house on a rainy day, etc., etc., etc. This note itself furnishes material for pages of commentary, but for the moment, the point I'd like to take from it is that right at the beginning of the period in which it's been plausible and conventional to draw a psychological distinction between active purpose and distracted relaxation, with the latter manufactured or supplied from the outside, as Coleridge has it, the primary commodities targeted as the source of such substitutive pleasures are books, in the form of the ephemeral literature of the circulating libraries. The psychology of reading and the psychology of consumption, here the mass consumption of 100 other brains afflicted with the same trance, developed together from the start. Jarrell's Sad Heart piece is a later development of this post-romantic genre, in which the artist is represented in more or less melancholy isolation within and from a world of rapid consumption, with little or no place for genuine creativity. The supermarket makes no direct appearance in Jarrell's text, but its role in epitomizing a bland standardization attributed to the people and the habitations of mid-century American society is itself at the time a standard one. As a matter of cultural history, the supermarket occupies, in ideas of the development of 20th century consumer culture, a place analogous to that of the department store in the 19th. Both are large-scale retailing institutions run on principles of fast turnover, low prices, and economies of scale at the level of both suppliers, cutting out the middleman, and outlet with a large selling space. But the differences mark out the dominant story of changes in shopping over the past 100 years. One sells primarily clothes, the other primarily food, whence a ready distinction between luxury goods and necessities, or between the aesthetic and the functional. The department store, I'm just repeating the standard story, represents the emergence of a bourgeois democratization of luxury, bringing aristocratic fashion and sophistication to the ladies of the middle classes, whereas the supermarket is convenient, standardized, and for the masses. The department store involves the pleasure of an excursion, a visit to the city. The supermarket is part of a dull suburban routine. The department store is French and exotic. The supermarket is blandly American. The first half of this last comparison is patently false, since department stores began simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic. But that, of course, doesn't alter the force of the European connotation of department stores. The Americanness of the supermarket, on the other hand, is a historical fact. Supermarkets began as a makeshift experiment of the Depression years, when empty warehouses and factories in out-of-town sites were rented out and used as depots from which customers came in their Fords to pick up cheap supplies of food and other goods. Not only did they have to travel outside their own neighbourhoods, they also picked up the goods themselves, instead of asking for what they wanted at a counter. Despite misgivings as to whether people would be prepared to do their own distribution and wait on themselves in this unprecedented way, the idea caught on rapidly, and soon self-service was enshrined as the great 20th century innovation in retailing practice. After the war, supermarkets and self-service were exported to Europe, quite consciously as American innovations, and accompanying other related changes, preeminently the increasing importance of brand name goods, also identified as thoroughly American, even when, as in this case, they weren't. In Jarrell's late 50s version, the supermarket, at that time associated with a relentless materialistic brio, readily offers itself as the negative terrain in which to isolate the poetic critic of contemporary society. The sad heart and the supermarket are set up in stark semantic contrast, derived from utterly incompatible psychical and historical landscapes: soul and economy, depth and superficiality, duration and ephemerality, the authentic and the artificial, the personal and the anonymously massive. The vocabulary of the melancholy heart has no place in the brightly modern psychology of the female masses of supermarket shoppers, their hypnotic trances supplied from the outside by the motivation scientists. Poetic feeling and mass consumption are apparently worlds apart. On one side, pathetic anachronism, and on the other, the false materialism of progress. The still atomized voice of a private self on one side, and on the other, the loud and inexorable forces that are and make the masses. Jarrell's essay includes a critique of the production of driven consumers, a process which he characterizes in terms of the severest functionalism of organized mass psychology. What does our society need, he says, for us to need? Oh, it needs for us to do or be many things, to be workers, technicians, executives, soldiers, housewives. But first of all, last of all, it needs for us to be buyers, consumers, beings who want much and will want more, who want consistently and insatiably. Find some spell to make us no longer want the fur stoles, the records, and the weapons, and our world will change into something to us unimaginable. Find some spell to make us realize that the product or service which seemed yesterday an unthinkable luxury is today an inexorable necessity, and our world will go on. A wanting consistently and insatiably, focused on things to buy, is engineered to ensure the perpetual motion, our world will go on, of an economy constantly working its bad psychological magic. This world of consumer compulsion is explicitly characterized as feminine. It's a standard joke of our culture, says Jarrell, that when a woman is bored or sad, she buys something to make herself feel better. But in this respect, we are all women together, and can hear complacently the reminder of how feminine this consumer world of ours is. One imagines as a characteristic dialogue of our time an interview in which someone is asking of a vague, gracious figure, a kind of Mrs. America, "But while you waited for the intercontinental ballistic missiles, what did you do?" She answers, "I bought things." What lies behind the comparison or identification between femininity and desperate therapeutic shopping to distract or to counter an anxiety? The femininity of consumption is apparently, at one level, the last joke for a culture in which buying has become the end-all and the be-all. So much have we all become women that we don't even mind that we are. It was becoming increasingly common at this time to speak of the contemporary cultural developments associated with mass or consumer culture in terms of a feminization. The expression implies a straightforward and pathological movement from activity, rationality, and control to passivity and a susceptibility to things that falsely present themselves as desirable or necessary. The trash can of the popular sociology of the 50s and 60s is stacked high with the debris of this feminization story, which was not unamenable to a feminist version too. If we are all women now, that is not, so the argument goes, because women are naturally passive or susceptible, but because those deceptions are so powerful that they are depriving men as well as women of the full humanity that rightfully and potentially belongs to both sexes, and to which women, more than men, have been denied access by culture in the past. While the feminization argument can be straightforwardly misogynist, attributing all the degenerate tendencies to one sex, in its feminist version the assumption is that there's fundamentally no difference between the sexes, and that such differences that have come to be significant are merely contingent, capable of reversal or redirection towards a neutrality that must be preferable for both sexes. This feminist critique shares with the marketing methods it objects to a disparagement of femininity, femininity seen not as nature but as fabrication. But even so, the relentless gendering of shopping seems at times, even when the overt emphasis is that of critique, to be inseparable from a sense of the attractiveness of the despised feminine identity. Here we might compare the Sad Heart essay with a poem of Jarrell's, in which the speaker describes himself, sometimes watching on television my favourite serial, A Sad Heart at the Supermarket, the story of a woman who had everything. What's interesting here is the ambiguously ironic interest on the part of the masculine poetic subject in the soap opera, and the specification of the sad heart at the supermarket as a woman's. In the context of the use of the phrase as an essay title, its different resonance here has the effect of blurring the edges, on the one hand between the mass culture of the TV audience and the different culture of the artist, and on the other between masculine and feminine identifications on one or other side of this hypothetical divide. In another of his essays on mass culture, The Taste of the Age, Jarrell elevates literary consumption to a paradigm status in the general field of consumption. The greatest American industry, he says, why has no one ever said so, is the industry of using words. We pay tens of millions of people to spend their lives lying to us, or telling us the truth, or supplying us with a nourishing medicinal compound of the two. All of us are living in the middle of a dark wood, a bright, technicoloured forest of words, words, words. It's a forest in which the wind is never still. There isn't a tree in the forest that's not, for every moment of its lives and our lives, persuading or ordering or seducing or overawing us into buying this, believing that, voting for the other. And yet the more words there are, the simpler the words get. The professional users of words process their product as if it were baby food, and we babies. All we have to do is open our mouths and swallow. Most of our mental and moral food is quick-frozen, pre-digested, spoon-fed. Here, where verbal production is made the exemplary and the principal industry in what's characterized as a general economy of persuasion, the image is not so much one of feminization as of infantilization. There's the commonplace comparison of the consumption of goods to the literal intake of food, and in this instance its exemplification in baby food is particularly intriguing. Baby food is avowedly like the words that are simpler, and though this might suggest an image of organic naturalness, instead, like the bright technicoloured forest, it's transmuted into the opposite, an image of manufactured artifice, quick-frozen, pre-digested. The allusion here to the labels on processed food, this is from the early 50s when this was big news, is in turn related to the mention earlier in this section of an instant literary food. He goes on, one sees in stores ordinary old-fashioned oatmeal or cocoa, and side by side with it another kind called instant cocoa, instant oats. Most of our literature, I use the word in its broadest sense, is instant literature. The words are short, easy, instantly recognizable words. The thoughts are easy, familiar, instantly recognizable thoughts. The attitudes are familiar, already agreed upon, instantly agreeable, instantly acceptable attitudes. There's thus a lowest common denominator objection. The instant is where no one has to think twice because it already corresponds in a recognizable way to what they think. Jarrell's critique also collectivizes the responses. It's to majorities or minorities that appeals are made. and the mind that reacts is a collective us, not that of an individual. Again, this is characteristic of representations of the period, and is in keeping with the explicit feminization of consumption by which they're often accompanied. The techniques of persuasion, techniques suggesting both efficiency and artifice, act upon a mentality that's uniform across individual manifestations and that can be assumed to be constant and completely predictable in its responses. This is a mentality that does not think, that merely takes in impressions without working on them or modifying them. Where a mind is taken to be what does work on or modify its materials, this mental apparatus, Where a mind is taken to be what does work on or modify its materials, this mental apparatus is mindless, as are the mechanical techniques that address it or manipulate it. It's at this point where the mindless masses of consumers match the mindless techniques that operate upon them, that the prevailing image of mental and social engineering or brainwashing derive its force. Such images are already cliches in their own time, as though in reinforcement of the automatism they describe, as the apogee of American capitalism as individual freedom comes to be regularly, not just waywardly, represented in the image of its ideological inverse, the cold force of communist thought control. Jarrell's complaint against instant literature takes up many aspects of these contemporary representations. In this usage, given separately by the dictionary as of a processed food that can be prepared for use immediately, the word instant entered the language specifically in the context of brand name consumer goods and the vocabulary of package labelling. The first Oxford English Dictionary citation is for a 1912 advertisement in the Ladies' Home Journal, and the second from a book published in 1915, where the quotation is, "I wish I had drunk less of that hogwash that my wife calls instant coffee." Not only does this neatly reflect the association of distasteful consumer goods with women, the wife somehow becoming identified with the hogwash because she's dumb enough to advertise it as having some resemblance to coffee. But suggestively enough, the quotation is taken from a strikingly early philosophical discussion of psychoanalysis, Edwin B. Holt's The Freudian Wish and Its Place in Ethics. Instant corroboration, if you like, of the connections in the early part of this century between the wishes analysed by consumer psychology and by the interpretation of dreams. From these two early instances of instant, the OED jumps to the late 1950s, when it appears in an almost paradigm role as your grand new world of jet airplanes, nylon stockings, frozen food, instant coffee, again, and brainwashing. This heterogeneous list, as a mode of characterization, is itself indicative of the developments that Jarrell summarized in the notion of instant literature, and that the OED entries go on to exemplify in entries from the early 60s, referring to debates about intriguing topics such as instant history and then instant sex. Such a list, in addition to its associations of speed, modernity, consumer abundance, and high technology, derives its rhetorical force from its own deployment of the linguistic devices of quick-fire brand name advertising, with the keyword or buzzword that stands metonymically for a cultural attitude that in fact consists, so the language suggests, only in the sum of such multifarious and constantly moving parts. Instant is such a word, both in its history, it's recognizably derived from 20th century consumer culture, and in its meaning. The instant product abolishes the gap between origin and end, wish and satisfaction, abolishes time altogether in its reduction to the infinitesimally small unit. The cessation of time is also the end of causality and connection. There's nothing left except a series of unrelated instants. The instant product also has connotations of a speed and efficiency that are to function in the face of time conceived of as rush and hurry, too much to do. Avoidance of waste is the usual and acceptable criterion for efficiency in classical economic theories, and time is one of the quantifiable resources to which it's applied. In the transfer of this model of time as a scarce resource from production to consumption, from the factory to the home, the consumer is placed in an equivalent position to the entrepreneur. She's addressed as someone who, in the interests of maximizing efficiency, has no time to lose. In advertising terms, this working analogy is also a way of warding off the adverse associations that might be attached to the notion of an instant food as too labour-saving, as avoiding the effort which the housewife ought to be putting into her productions. Much ink, as well as many yolks, were spilled in the 50s over the introduction of cake mixes, which were first of all marketed with all the ingredients already mixed in a single packet, and then in a just add an egg variety, the reason supposedly being that housewives preferred to think of themselves as supplying some necessary time and creativity to the preparation. Looked at from another angle, instant also has associations not so much of efficiency as of magic. The product simply is, with no evidence of a process of time or labour involved in getting it either into the smooth, hygienic neatness of its package or from its package into the container for its consumption. The instant product just pops up, is no sooner here than vanished, but always potentially available to satisfy your every random whimsical want. No residue of guilt, just as the thing itself can be thrown straight away. There's nothing left over on the side of the subject or the object, both of which are represented in identical terms. This is the point at which the instant product meets the impulse buy in the full coincidence of their perfect psychological match. The impulse purchase, a cornerstone of everyday supermarket psychology in the manuals and trade journals aimed at supermarket managers, is derived from an assumption that actions can be straightforwardly divided into the planned and the unplanned. From this point of view, the ideal customer is normally thought of as the one who comes in unprepared, without a list, and whose passage through the store will take her through unfamiliar or unnecessary paths where she may be diverted by the attraction of products she came in with no intention of buying. The impulse which prompts the picking up of the product is the exact subjective correlative of the instant object. It appears as an immediate response to the sighting of the object whose acquisition instantly lays it once again to rest. The very transference of the impulse from purchaser to purchase in the expression impulse buy, which can refer either to the act or to the thing bought, but never to the buyer whose impulse it is indicative of the exactness of the correspondence. Impulse purchase and instant product are two sides of the same coin, in which consumers and commodities come to be possessed of identical psychological attributes. In the imaginary of supermarket literature, nothing limits the proliferation of new products to attract and then satisfy an ever-mobile range of coordinated desires that come to meet them from one disconnected instant to the next. People and products, from this point of view as well, are identical categories, in each of which new attributes must be found or invented to keep the flow of both of them moving through the store. To gain a place on the shelves, products must be able to be represented as new, meaning different from all the rest, which may include the fact of newness. Differentiation can be announced according to categories that are themselves capable of infinite modification and supplementation, and which come and go with the fluctuations and wars of the cultural values that they also contribute to shaping. Modern now sounds dated, new is perennial, and low cholesterol, low fat, low tar, and so on, rates ever higher. An American study of product innovation in the mid-60s, for a period of just 3 years, tried to distinguish the really new from the not really new, according to 3 categories of newness, which were the innovative, the genuinely new, or the distinctly new, sort of new. Manufacturers had to do some preparatory research and test marketing. And thirdly, the me too, new only in the shape, the size, the flavour, the fact that this company is making it rather than another one, and so on. According to this particular set of standards, the following products were found to be truly innovative: dehydrated flaked potatoes, all-purpose instant flour, frozen juice and synthetic juice concentrates, liquid diet foods, instant non-fat dry milk, recooked rice, semi-moist dog food, powdered non-dairy creamers, 3 types of cold breakfast cereal, pre-sweetened nutritional and with dried fruit, soft margarine, freeze-dried soluble coffee, boil-in-the-bag vegetables and frozen dinners. Since then, the study adds, 2 others could be added: dry cocktail mixes and space food sticks. 30 years on, the list reads like a sort of surreal hymn to 60s sci-fi fantasy, instant, high-tech, space age. At the same time, the American critic Leslie Fiedler was concluding his latest conspectus of American Cultural Prospects, a book called Waiting for the End, published in 1964, on an ambivalently ironic positive note, with a rather different version of product innovation. This involved a striking transposition of the literary into the supermarket. For a long time, Fiedler says, the index of literacy has crept inexorably upward. The paperbacks in supermarkets have proliferated until there's scarcely room for bread and milk, and the boards of directors of large corporations have invited intellectuals to lecture their junior executives on Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard and Freud. This fantasy of food for thought, displacing ordinary staples literally off the supermarket shelves, should not mask a minor historical fact, which may or may not have been filed in the open stacks of Fiedler's mind. Just as the circulating libraries are forerunners of fast turnover consumer institutions of the 19th century, so in the history of shop design, it's bookshops, strangely enough, which are the precursors of supermarkets. They, alone of all types of shop, were laid out on shelves that were not behind counters, or not always, with the goods arranged for casual browsing and for what was not yet called self-service. Also, at a time when brand-name goods and their accompanying packages were only just beginning, books already came in a comparable form. They had covers that were designed at once to protect the contents and to entice the purchaser. They were proprietary products with identifiable authors and new titles, not just any novel, but the latest so-and-so. Jarrell doesn't imagine the unlively aisles of the imaginary supermarket as a milieu for poetry. But that's perhaps the ironic point of Allen Ginsberg's mid-50s poem, A Supermarket in California, in which the speaker, in my hungry fatigue, goes shopping for images in the aisles full of bright fruit and happy families, spotting Lorca down by the watermelons, and Whitman poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. I wandered in and out of the brilliant stacks of cans following you, and followed in my imagination by the store detective. We strode down the open corridors together in our solitary fancy, tasting artichokes, possessing every frozen delicacy, and never passing the cashier. Something more than a deadening, mechanical, anti-poetic economy is being activated here, as though this impulse poem from Howl could remake the figure of the poetic flaneur in the fantasy of a deviant shopper. But in both these images of following and being followed, and of having it all and encountering no barrier, Ginsberg in fact neatly captures or falls in with what are themselves already well-worn paths in the annals of supermarket psychology, if not of supermarket poetry. First, the surveillance, not only by detectives, but also by the assigned surveyors mapping shoppers' movements around a store. And second, the solitary fancy that the self-service to and fro plan is deliberately designed to foster. It's the model consumer, as well as the transgressive one, who drifts about, filling the trolley with all the things that, in the reversal by which ordinary language so accurately puts it, take her fancy. Until the arrival at the barrier, the store is like a fantasy space where you really can have anything and everything you want, letting the trolley pile high with whatever happens to find its way in, with no obligation to purchase. This cold contrast between the dreamy drift round the aisles and the hard, frustrating lines at the checkout has been the subject of a continuous stream of supermarket literature, which reached its height in a spate of PhD theses in business studies or economics at the turn of the 50s and 60s, on the subject of how to hasten customers' passages past the tills and therefore give them a more contented exit. Not until the 80s did computer technology provide a breakthrough in this perennial checkout impasse with the invention of barcodes. But still, my feminine heart goes out to the man whose youth was passed in the research for a Cornell PhD on a comparison of the turnover per customer and rate of checkout between 3 Ithaca supermarkets, 1959 to 61. And my heart goes out even more to the gratefully acknowledged young wife who typed the thing up. There's much more to be related of the strange features of the supermarket exit, as indeed of the histories of supermarket psychology. On one side, the research to find ways of increasing sales, and on the other, the implied psychology of those with different interests, from poets to consumer activists to social critics. My suggestion has been that the putting together of these different histories can not only illuminate local details of a history of shopping, but also given the social and psychological significance of the culture of consumption and the ways of thinking associated with it, shed light on aspects of our thinking about identities, both collective and individual. As a final checkout sample, I'd like to offer one more illustration from just before the post-war heyday in this country of consumer society. In 1948, in this country, John Newsom published with Faber a little book called The Education of Girls, approvingly prefaced by Rab Butler. A chapter of the book is addressed to a question entitled Women as Purchasers, which, in the light of past and future arguments and assumptions about women, consumption, and political or national identities, is quite a remarkable text. On its own terms as well, the chapter's confusions and contradictions in all these areas are revealing. Newsom begins from the empirical fact of women being by far the principal purchasers, and a less obviously accurate premise that it is therefore they who largely determine the quality and nature of goods produced, more than, for instance, the producers or their promoters. From this, further assertions follow. There are absolute aesthetic standards, and if women are not up to them, then not only the beauty of our homes, but also our national economy will suffer. He says, "The position of woman as purchaser is of great importance. By her standards, or lack of them, will be decided the type and quality of goods produced, goods which will adorn the homes and bodies of millions of English people, provide satisfaction or irritation to those who live with them, and affect the value of our export trade. She it is, in fact, who determines our standard of living. It is too much to expect the average manufacturer to design two quite distinctive articles for home and foreign consumption, and however poor our domestic criteria, there is a strong probability that foreigners will be expected to like and buy the same products. Unfortunately, foreign buyers are no longer restricted to the purchase of British manufactured goods, and if they disapprove of our quality and design, they will go elsewhere. It is of national importance, therefore, that the home market should be critical of ugliness and inefficient commodities, not only because they will desecrate our own homes and countryside, but because they will react on our trade balance." There are wild swings here, from the lyrical to the mundane. She it is who determines our standard of living, or from the apocalyptic to the pathetic. They will desecrate our homes, they will react upon our trade balance. Quite literally, this passage is poised halfway, or rather at both extremes, between poetry and economics. There's a lurking inversion of Pope's The Rape of the Lock, with the mock heroic style, not so much with the woman being satirized here, not so much for her narcissistic adornment with all the exotic creams and perfumes and jewels of colonial trade, what Pope calls the various offerings of the world, but rather being mocked for her failure and criticized for her failure to perform as a competent export agent or to provide an aesthetic environment for the masses, goods which will adorn the homes and bodies of millions of English people. From another point of view, this is a 20th century rewriting of Ruskin's Of Queen's Gardens. In the Ruskin essay, the woman is responsible for the sweet ordering of domestic life, and also, in a negative sense, responsible for all social ills, including war, because it's up to her to have prevented such outbursts of masculine aggression. In Newsom's version, both aesthetic and moral duties find a new place in the field of consumption. She has a responsibility for the success of her country's economy. It's her fault too if it doesn't work, and also a responsibility for the beauty of the domestic milieu. Much could be said, for which there's no time now, about the relationship of Newsom's discussion, and in particular what he goes on to claim about advertising in female psychology, to ideas about mass consumption and femininity that were to be much bandied about in the following decades of the consumer society. A further dimension of the argument is thrown into relief by developments much later, when the public rhetoric of the 80s elevated the figure of the consumer to its hitherto unattained status as the embodiment of rational citizenship, considered as a matter of individual interests and rights. In the light of this character, reasonably seeking a reasonable and efficiently delivered deal for himself in every department of life, the Newsom female consumer is revealed as representing a rather different model of citizenship, involving ideas of collective responsibility as well as of feminine culpability, and some concern for social welfare as well as for national interests. In 1948, the British housewife hadn't yet stepped into a supermarket, and more things were to appear in the local town centre and later the out-of-town Greenfields site than were dreamt of in her philosophy. More types of consumer, too, in their devious and rational and stupid and infinitely mobile ways, were to people the discourses of the late 20th century with their familiar or phantom-like and often amazing forms. For by now, in the 1990s, the phones are rarely out of order and the shops are open on Sundays. That's it.
Take some questions.
Mm.
Anyone have any questions?
Could I just ask a question? I'm sorry if it's kind of a very perhaps. What is the position of male shopper?
Now,
Well, in this argument.
many different ones. I mean, it's quite interesting how the male shopper has been very explicitly targeted recently as a supermarket shopper, for example, and in particular, which would fall in with the general way that, I mean, that advertising, marketing is indifferent to gender or any other sort of distinction. If it sort of sees a new category that, or a possible category that can be turned into a consumer in line with that identity that's being targeted, then it'll go for it. And man is a fairly obvious, available one, but many of the other identities are partly created by advertising, like the 30-something shopper a few years ago was a big sort of new image in magazines and so on. And it seems almost as if the 30-somethings started to identify themselves as 30-somethings by way of that imagery. But the gender thing is very interesting because it is a major shift in, and obviously ties in with a whole lot of other changes in masculine identities. The way the supermarkets are targeting the father, for instance, the new man father, and most of those baby-friendly ads that the supermarkets are putting around will make a point of having the father out with the baby, not the mother, to show how modern they are.
But also it's the fact that the baby's a little boy. I mean, it's
Yeah.
for advertising.
Yes. That's true.
Yeah.
I was really interested in what you said about the transgressive shopper being equal in behaviour to the model shopper within the supermarket. I think about that in whether the supermarket becomes a kind of unofficial cruising ground. Just wondering, that has been taken up.
Yes.
In advertising very overtly.
Yeah. But yeah, again, only recently, I think, because some of this in this country, it's been going on in America for some time. I think some of the supermarkets actually have singles nights, where you deliver in London now too. Yes, but it's quite a recent thing that they've cottoned onto as a possibility, and there's quite a lot about it in, say, Armistead Maupin's stories, San Francisco. Things. It became a theme, and then it's as if it was in literature and films and so on before it became a thing that supermarkets themselves tried to cultivate. But yes, I mean it's almost that's related too to the way the supermarket can become a sort of interior street, and it was always represented architecturally by planners as a street with a traffic flow and so on. And it's again sort of remarkable that it's taken them decades to get into the idea of having the street as fantasy as well as the street as efficiency or movement of goods and people through it. Which is not to say it hasn't been used in that way all the time, but certainly there. Sorry, you were saying something.
I suppose what I was interested in was the
Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
I mean, one of the things that seems to be kind of raised by the whole argument is the way in which kind of antagonistic critiques of shopping shopped object is a substitution for something
Yes.
else.
Yeah.
In the same way that the conventional Marxist critique of consumption is that it's, in some sense, a kind of artificial and
Yeah.
therefore substituted kind of object. And the bizarre thing about kind of shopping in the 80s is that that very critique became, as it were, internalized and part of the motor of shopping.
Yes.
So that, as it were, there's a high degree of self-consciousness
Yes.
within shopping, that it's a substitutive act. Far from kind of being put down like that, it almost begins to advertise itself on the basis that it's a substitutive kind of activity, and therefore kind of, in a sense, is less dangerous. I mean, okay, so it's a substitute desire, but that's much less dangerous. That's less dangerous than the real desire. Thought about it, if you remember, in the trial of the Menendez brothers in California a couple of years ago. They're on trial for killing their parents. Well, after they'd kind of incredibly bloodily murdered them, there's a question about what happened to them. They said they were stricken by grief, at which the prosecution got up and said, funnily enough, we have your American Express cards here, which showed that you went out and spent 3 days kind of buying Rolex watches on their credit cards. But the defense then turned around, they brought an analyst into court and said, of course they did. It's grief shopping. What would you expect if you just killed someone? You've got to go shopping. But it's,
Yes.
it's the way in which the substitution kind of sets up a sort of, an alibi or a substitution for anything.
Yes.
It's,
Or a displacement or anything.
yes.
But I think you're right that people are very conscious of that as well. I mean, it's what distinguishes shopping from many other kinds of activities, and people will endlessly discuss their own shopping behaviour as mildly pathological in a way they wouldn't discuss anything else that they do in that way. So there's an element of the idea of shopping as being a place where we act funny, and we act quite simply. We're not being ourselves, but we are being odd. That is a sort of part of daily life and part of the way people... I mean, everybody has theories about shopping and about themselves as shoppers in a quite a distanced way that they don't have about other things, whether it's sex or eating or anything else.
But in order to deploy that argument now, it starts from the assumption that it is indeed a substitution. I mean, an analyst would be wasting their time pointing out, that it was a substitute for something.
Yes.
Because the person knows it
Yeah.
perfectly
Yeah.
well.